And it reminds me of a quote from NASA. He goes, look for the big holes when we're trying to figure out where the minerals were on the moon. I said, why? He goes, what do you think causes a big hole in the moon? I'm like, asteroid. He goes, right. There's a big rock somewhere. Go find it. So the point is a snip, there's something there. So that's the big rock. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Our next episode of AI in Healthcare is a distinct treat for me. I have two good friends on tonight. My co-host is Dr. Lindsey Cotton, who you will learn is an expert in these areas. And we've asked her to recently join the Tensor Black fold as we didn't have enough brains on the circuit. And so, Lindsey, we need your big intellect. And we're going to be glad to have you co-hosting occasionally here as Sanjay needed the night off for his kids' baseball. I'll introduce my dear friend, Scott Penberthy, who, Scott, you and I met the same day that Sanjay and I met. I don't know if you put that together. We were all speaking at an event, and Sanjay was teaching us about social media, and you and I were talking about sort of the future of medicine and healthcare, and we all hit it off, and we became fast friends. And now, fast forward probably 3-4 years, and our lives have all traveled in close parallel, but have never gotten that far from each other. So, guys, Scott is a brilliant friend of mine. He is employed by Google, but really does so much more than that. He's an AI aficionado that we'll have introduce his backstory as we get into this, but really has dedicated himself to the fight against cancer. And you'll understand why as we go through our own 3 personal stories, because we've all been touched by this in deep and affecting ways that put us on this path to be together tonight. So, Scott, I'm so glad to have you back. Well, maybe we start there, Scott. For the audience who has not met you on our earlier podcast, you'd been on a long time ago when it was targeted oncology. And man, it's been a lifetime of development of artificial intelligence, digital health, and the tools that we're all using. And you've been instrumental in building some of them and certainly well advised as to the development of some of the others. Maybe share with the audience a little bit of who you are, your dark origin story of how you became a supervillain. I don't know if you were spilled into a vat of hot oil or toxins, but somehow you started your AI journey at 16, right? Yeah, Doug. So let's see if I can compress it into a few beats. So it started when I was always fat, and a kid, there was only 2 jobs available. You'd be a cowboy or an astronaut. So I chose astronaut. And so I always wanted to be an astronaut. So I went to, and I just chased it, loved Star Trek and all that, everything around the space race, and wrote some games to play Star Trek. That got me an MIT when I was 15 at the time. And so I walk in saying, I'm gonna be an astronaut. So I take the first course, Lindsey and I go in, and I fail because I can't do 20 pull-ups. And then, I could do the sit-ups, but then I had my eyesight was 20/25, Doug. And then I said, you can't be an astronaut. Sorry. So I'm like, my life was over. I felt at 16, and I was walking across campus, Lindsey. And then I saw a sign of my future just sitting there, and it said free beer. And so I followed upstairs, and that was the top floor of 545 Tech Square, which is the MIT AI lab. Right. I saw robots going around. I saw a guy like Jerry Garcia. He's the guy who invented Linux. He was there. Old guy with hair on the side, looks like Einstein. That's Marvin Minsky. So I fell in love with AI ever since then, Doug. And I've been at it for a long time. And, my mom passed away in my 30s, about 20 years later. And she was dying. She said, can you help with cancer? And I'm like, what do you say? It's you see that end of life transition of, the steroids and what it does to disfigurement. It's just so hard to watch. And she asked me to help. And I'm a programmer. I don't know anything. Right. And I said, sure, Mom, I don't know. She said, what we're doing now, burn it out, cut it out. There's got to be a better way. Can you find something? I'm like, my brother became an oncologist. And it wasn't until the pandemic that I learned about next generation sequencing. And then I saw that. I'm like, you're kidding me. I mean, you can read the code. And so I'm like, just reprogram it. I met people like you, and they're like, no, it's not that easy. I'm like, come on, we can reprogram it. And they all thought I'm nuts. And I just kept chasing it. And that's where I ran into Leroy Hood. And I was an AI guy for, a couple of decades. And he wanted to do what he called hyperscale AI. I said, what is it? He goes, I don't know either. I said, well, I walked him through what I do the videos, like, oh my God, this could work. And so so that's what I've been working on for the last 7 years, really, is trying to apply the techniques we use in AI to actually look at, as Demis says, a chunky version of the body, nanoscale. It's not Planck scale, but there's a lot of things you can do to understand DNA and RNA. It's kind of like sequence the body, sequence the tumor, look at the difference, and target the difference. mRNA-based drugs, CAR T therapy, that sort of thing. So I've learned a lot about that. I help Lee Hood in a lot of what he does, and he's very patient with me, I guess. And so we meet until very recently. We meet regularly now less regularly, like every month or so. But he coaches me on biology, and I coach him on AI, and that's been our partnership for almost 5 years now. Yeah, for our audience, I should clarify. So Scott is one of the editors on my journal that I'm the editor-in-chief, AI and Precision Oncology. So is Dr. Hood. And so just for the audience who doesn't know Lee is a luminary of luminaries, really should have won the Nobel Prize, was deeply instrumental in the first DNA sequencing when he ran the department at Caltech. He's now well into his 80s, but getting up at 5 a.m, doing hundreds of push-ups and just still lighting things up. Lindsey, he just published a book last year called The Age of Scientific Wellness, and it is fantastic. I think chapter 9 is all about cancer and a lot of the things that Scott's working on. So very, very cool. And now we came together with very similar approaches. Lindsey, I don't know if now's a good time to talk about your own backstory, because it's kind of similar, isn't it?
Yeah, it is similar. So, background in clinical medicine for many years, and then to make this real short, I made a huge leap into the research side. I felt as though there was more out there that I could help with outside of my own patient population. And so I ended up getting into research. And similarly to you, but right around COVID or 2019 is when I got into the NGS space of on the medical side of researching, building out clinical trials and looking at early detection using blood-based biomarkers. And during that process, I was a few years in, and I was handed a project of working on lung cancer specifically. And so my entire world was focused on early detection of lung cancer. As you know, there's a lot of disparities of our screening in that space. We're catching it way too late. It's a leading cause of cancer-related death. And so I was handed this big project, and I was working on designing a clinical trial for how we can actually validate a blood-based biomarker for early lung cancer detection, similar to how we've used it in the past with, stool-based testing with colonoscopy. So that adjunct has really helped propel colonoscopy adherence. So doing the same for lung, and a few months in, very shockingly, my father was diagnosed with lung cancer. And, seeing really good physicians and a great system, but they did not offer NGS testing. And so I had to go into the office and fight for and bring in a company that would offer him that care and really start moving the field forward from like a grassroots perspective. So I had this clinician hat on, taking care of him, but then also my research hat, pushing the field forward and then trying to advocate for better care. So my professional passion or purpose became a passion. And so I've been heavily focused in moving that forward ever since. So yeah, one of the things that I think of in this space is, over the last few years, with my experience focusing on biomarkers and early detection, there's so many areas in this space that we can go through with AI and how it's going to impact, or already is impacting, the oncology space. And arguably, detecting it earlier is one of those pivotal moments of where we can make a huge impact. And I've seen in just the last few years how AI in healthcare has really evolved from just like this simple automation into systems that can reason across all these data systems, generating clinical insights, increasingly operate in what many are calling like agentic workflows. And at the same time, as you've seen, I'm sure in the work that you've been doing with the groups you work with, and I know you also do a lot of advocacy work and work on the policy side, but healthcare is struggling with clinician burnout. It's one of the reasons I actually shifted. I wanted to do more, but it's so easy to get burnt out in doing patient care all day. And so the fragmented data systems, this explosion of all this information. So I'm really curious on your perspective on, what really today, like not the hype cycle, but where are we today with the state of AI in medicine? Like what excites you at night? Like what you can't go to sleep at night because you're so excited and like that moment, like what is that for you?
A couple of things. I think what I'm seeing for the first time is that we're actually programming the human body, right? And to me, and what I find so interesting, Lindsey, is that, I right now in my role at Google, I work a lot with video models. And what's astonishing is that the technique behind the video models, it's learning physics and Navier-Stokes equations, are like complex equations of how do you get a SpaceX ship to Mars, like all the equations for the gases and the rockets. That's all called Navier-Stokes. It's a high-dimensional physics, hard to learn. We're learning it through observation. We're learning gravitational pull. We're learning emotion through observation.
And what's interesting is as you learn that, what works that shouldn't work and is still astonishing is that now that you learn information theory behind physics in these models, which is sort of astonishing, that maps extremely well into biology. And so there's something funky about the universe where actually as you understand the information theory about things that are pixels and language, there's something about the language of biology and it's mapping very well to understand the genome. And so I said, well, what do you store in the genome? You got 3 billion pairs, you got these 23 chromosomes. Like, how do you start? And it reminds me of a quote from NASA. He goes, look for the big holes when we're trying to figure out where the minerals were on the moon. I said, why? He goes, what do you think causes a big hole in the moon? I'm like, asteroid. He goes, right. There's a big rock somewhere. Go find it. So the point is a SNP, there's something there. So that's the big rock. And we're starting to see is like a Google, we can go across like for 1 million and start to understand what that million, it seems like a big number. It's actually a very small sequence. The biggest one says like 10,000. We're starting to be able to understand the meaning of that, and that expresses language. And what's so astonishing, Lindsey, is that now the models, as we improve things for like cat memes and videos, which are fun and get the cost down, that same damn thing works for AlphaFold, right? And so what's happening, you got this loop where now more and more of these things are happening, and there's now a play of like, Alphabet's looking at sort of big pharma. Can we actually have AI help find the drugs and help explore it? And have like what they call an agentic lab, Doug, where like the AI itself figures out how do you explore this huge space, like playing the game of Go? How do you explore this space of finding a drug, actually run the experiments in the lab, grow on the Petri dish, take the output, and then use that to adjust the next set and close that loop, right? So now imagine your drug discovery shrinks dramatically. And then they're like, well, how about trials? That's okay, Scott. Let's just take 3 years down to 3 weeks. That's amazing. Well, you still got the clinical trials, or do you? So now we're looking at, well, wait a second. If I can understand physics in these models, can I have a model for a human being? And if I have a model for a human being that's kind of like this, not the real thing, but it's good enough for horseshoes, like good enough to understand who you are, can I then have artificial beings that mimic different populations and say, where do I really test this? So for example, if you're testing a COVID-19 drug, your test should come back and go, there's something going on with the spine and something going on with the heart. Look for people with these genetic modifications around the heart and the spine, because those antigens on basically that look a lot like the COVID. And so your body, if you have genetic mutations, you may actually attack your heart or may attack your nervous system. And we see that a lot in the popular media, as you well know, of like, it's bad for you. No, COVID would have done that anyway, right? But the idea is, can we actually use AI to first compress dramatically the drug discovery and then go to the clinical trials and shrink that? So test where you really know the limits. And then on top, the next thing on top of the three is when I just met a drug company today, is that once you do the test, can we now candy stripe the drugs? So what I mean by that is like, okay, Lindsey, you can't take the drug, but I can because my genetic makeup allows me to be in that test that's been tested. So if I do a sequence of you or me, I know I can take it, you can't take it, right? And so now you can start to narrow down the drugs. So now what you do is you get an explosion of applicability of drugs, because now you can say this drug works for these type of populations with these characteristics, right? And really reduce the negative surface area. So I'm excited about just seeing these technologies in AI that understanding physics through video. That same thing is now being understood in biology. It shouldn't work. It does beautifully. There's something there. And so I think it's just I wake up every day saying, what is there? Like, it's like, why is this working? It's fantastic that it does, but it's the kind of thing where now we have what Lee calls hyperscale AI, where it's going to reason in spaces that we can't describe. Like, what's the cat function for video? It's easy for AI. This cat, or it's a dog, or is this a tumor or not? It's hard to describe, but it's very easy to learn with the data. And so I think that's what I'm super excited about, Lindsey, is like, as it's coming, one, how do we get the cost down? Right? It's still too expensive, way too much energy. If you get down to 3 orders of magnitude, could you do, we used to say that it's like when she comes out of prison in 2030, she'll walk out and it's actually working what she dreamed up in Theranos 30 years ago, completely different technology base, right? But are we starting to enter that era where now, because there's so much information in a drop of blood, as long as you're not looking for diseases that have a small, parts per million, but for big genetic things, you can find it in just a little bit of blood. It's amazing. So I'm excited about it to see where it goes.
Scott, one of the themes I think that links the two of you together. So Lindsey, you spent a lot of your time, probably 10 years in diagnostics, and the audience may or may not be aware that ctDNA, DNA methylation, even fragmentomics, some of the things that you were working with other companies, that is AI. right? We've known about cell-free DNA since the 1950s. We saw them on microscopes. We didn't know what the heck it was or what to do with it. It was only after we got these amazing pattern recognizers that you could separate the wheat from the chaff and understand that this cell-free DNA belonged here. This ctDNA did not. And what you're talking about when you're talking about the advent of hyperscale and large language models that are multimodal, this is the final quest for us. Whether it be AlphaFold or fragmentomics, the pattern recognizers can take 100 billion cells and say, these 300,000 cells needn't be there. Those don't belong there. Those are not part of the club. Those are not expected. The same way that AlphaFold, now AlphaFold 3, I think, and I would definitely want to get into that, is not only discerning like protein structure in 3D, but they're identifying the rules of physics that we have not yet identified. And so they're able to predict for the audience. Again, if this is so Doug nerding out, and thankfully I'm on with two even bigger nerds than me, of course. But Nobel Prize winning work for DeepMind back in October 2024 is Demis Hassabis, who's one of your friends, John Jumper, David Baker. They won the Nobel Prize for discerning how proteins should fold, not how they do fold, but being able to actually predict these 200,000 structures, because the modelers, the separating the wheat from the chaff, was able to identify rules that we can't explain yet and say, of course, this bent that direction. It follows this rule, but we don't know that rule yet. And so I think that's the power of the pattern recognizers. When we get into Lindsey's stuff about cancer screening and all three of us about how do we bend the curve, if we can appropriately train on gigantic data sets, these large language models, these pattern recognizers, the same skills that let them identify a croissant from a bagel or a donut, or cat versus dog, can identify a sickled cell or a leukemia cell or a DNA methylated mutation. And that's where I think when we talk about AI, we talk about it differently than maybe my layperson oncologist in my clinic. They still think it's a chatbot. So maybe let's talk a little bit about that. Scott, walk us through a little bit about the evolution here. So let's start with simple terms, rapid fire. Tell the team what you mean when you say large language model or LLM.
We realized in 2015, that's when it started, like now 11 years ago, right? If you play the game of Mad Libs, guessing the missing word, you can then turn words into math. And you're like, you got to be kidding me. It was called word to vec. And the idea is, could you actually start to do math on words? So in other words, you could say king minus man plus woman equals, the computer then in 2015 goes queen. Like, you got to be kidding me.
I thought I was going to say Lindsey.
There you go.
That's today's model, Lindsey. We're good.
So what happened is so that was a very, very small model, Doug. And what they found is that the bigger the network got, the smarter it got about understanding nuance of language. And it took people saying, well, how big can we go? And the first model was probably a few thousand neurons. And then we started to see this really strange thing. We did it about 2019, and we had 120 million, something called BERT. And like, it just kept getting better. And it really helps us with search. And then it took a few people going, what if you're like 10x this or 100x this? And I remember when they wanted to experiment with it, they said, well, we need a bigger computer. Like, we need a bigger boat. And apparently when they went to go ask for it, they said, what do you need? 6,000 processors. That's all of research. Like, what? How long do you need it for? 6 months solid. And like, you gotta be kidding me. This is 2019. That was the first dawn. It became the generative pre-trained transformer, GPT. And the team left some of Google to go take a big bet. They made a big bet, and it turned out to be right? And that was the large language model. And so this comes back to Ilya Sutskever in 2010, where he said, he was a student joining Jeff Hinton, one of the first founders, go, you're doing it wrong. Can you imagine hiring a grad student? You've been at this for 4 years, and he goes, you're doing it wrong. What do you mean you're doing it wrong? You got to think millions, not thousands, right? And that was Ilya. And now we're seeing trillion node models that are now understanding physics, biology, and we're not yet a foundation model for bio, but it's coming, right? And that's so LLMs, that's where it all comes from, Doug. It's a very small model that was just doing math on words, and we just kept getting it bigger and bigger and bigger. And now we're at trillion nodes versus a few thousand 10 years ago.
I think we would want to focus on the language that we hear just broadly in the landscape that people don't quite understand still. Because I think we could also go into just something really basic, which is understanding what a foundational model is. Like, what do we mean when we say a multimodal or a foundational model? I think we know what that means, but for everyone else, like a lay group that doesn't quite understand or isn't really well versed yet with AI, when we talk about foundational models and the excitement that we have behind what that is, do you have a way that you describe or explain like where we're moving
That
with these
is.
stacked models? Yeah.
Yeah. So I love that, Lindsay. So this was 2020, I think. I'm trying to think. It was not that long ago. There's a paper where the author list is 2 pages, right? It's 300 pages. So imagine 300 of the smartest people in a room, and they all authored the paper called Foundation Models. And what they observed, Lindsay, is as these things got bigger and bigger and bigger, and you're going from thousands, hundreds, thousands, millions, hundreds of millions, they made an observation that after you feed it the internet, literally, like encode the internet and Wikipedia, everything else, it started to do things like, hey, and we could figure out how to take an image and put it in. And it goes, here's an image. And you say, this is a cat, this is a dog. And instead of building a custom one, you could use that model because it has the world knowledge. It would go, oh, you mean like this cat? You're like, wait a second. I gave it almost no information. It knows cat. Well, it's read the internet, right? And they're saying this is a foundational change in AI, where you used to have to do a custom model. It used to take you 6 months for a small team for each one. This is a prompt, a couple areas on top of a model that's been trained on the internet and more, and it can learn just by what's called a few shots. And so that was a foundational change in AI, where once you have a world model that understands the internet and more in that video, what we used to do by hand, you can now do because it has a foundational knowledge. So they call those things foundation model era of AI. And it's really changed. Now, the old model's still useful. They're used a lot on devices and they're used on cameras and everything else. But the approach of AI is now about how do you give the prompt? How do you give the context for these models to tap into and activate the parts that it's learned from the internet? So it's a foundational change. And that was a paper saying student body left, like AI as a discipline just completely changed. And this was a couple of years before ChatGPT hit.
Just want to ask a couple more questions about basics, just so, because we're going to move fast into the future of medicine. Many of my colleagues, I know this will surprise you because you guys live in a different world, are just now starting to experiment. It's been 2.5, 3 years, and many of us live in these domains. I probably spend 6, 7 hours most days inside 2 or 3 different models and just popping back and forth. I might use one to graph or outline something else to write it, someone else for image generation. Can you just describe how you prompt? Are you talking in a whisper now? Are you still typing?
Yes. So I haven't written code. I'm a programmer. I just an engineer at Google, and even for my own stuff, I haven't written a line of code since last summer. Right. And I haven't Googled for 2 years. Right. And what I mean by that is that, I use Gemini all the time. Right. I use the other models. And so what's interesting is it really short circuits the distance from your question to an answer. Right. And then what I find is, I probably use search 10x to 100 times what I used to use it, but I don't do it. My agents do it. Right. And so it's interesting. My search volume goes up. You can see in companies, the search business is taking off. It's not humans, that's machines. Right. And so now agents search a lot more because they can click links and go nuts where I can't touch their speed. Right. So what I'm finding, Doug, is that it started with chat, but we're finding where it really starts to take off is where AI starts to go into your workflow, if you will. Right. So, and the biggest one we're all seeing is because you can actually generate like code and then test code, is a hard surface to see if it's right. Code turns out it's like leaps and bounds above all the other technologies. And we're seeing that with Anthropic and us and others, where coding is the number one. And now that's the model's taking off, and now it's built into their coding tools like Cursor, like Visual Studio, like we have another one called Anti-Gravity. And so what we're finding is AI now seeps into how you do your work. And what I find is that typing is now too slow. Right. And so what I do is, I'm an engineer. I work with creative people, and I got some feedback. You ever get feedback in HR? And so I got some feedback, and like, Scott, you got to communicate more clearly and succinctly, because I'm talking to brilliant creatives who aren't technologists. And so what I do is I take the feedback literally from HR, I put it in a doc, and I say, here's what I really want to say. I want to say this to Lindsay. Like, okay, wait, if you can talk to a doctor, here's what you should say. So I say it, I literally speak it. It goes in and the model spits out a note, and that's what I send Lindsey. She's like, wow, you really get me. I'm like, well, not me, right? But also do it so fast. Like I'm hiring, right? I'm hiring talent. You probably all hire doctors and everybody else. And to do things for fairness, we got to make sure it follows a certain guideline, evaluating certain characteristics. And it knows me. So I put that in. I talk to my mic and say, here's what I just heard. And I just freeform it. Oh, she likes football. She likes the Redskins and everything else. And like, that's not relevant, Scott. It takes that out and then takes what I've talked about in the past and does a perfect HR-ready summary. I voice a couple changes, makes a change, it goes in. 3 minutes after an interview. I'm like, Scott, you're so fast. I'm like, thanks. It's not me, right? And so I'm finding, Doug, is I started with chat, but that's the new world I live in, right? And now it's so at a point where by about 10, 11 o'clock in the morning, I run out of chips.
Yeah, me too.
I can't get enough tokens to do all the stuff. So it's like I exhausted at 11 and I barter for chips in the afternoon.
And you get very facile with one tool. For you, it's Gemini. And what I tell people when they're just getting in is pick any. Get in there and just get in the sandbox and mess around for a while. And you'll start to figure out that you already know how to prompt as a physician. That's called an H&P, right? It's providing detail. It's providing color. It's providing depth of conversation. And whether it's with a patient to try and evoke information or try and draw information out of them in more detail, how long did it last? How did it start? What were aggravating factors? What made it better? What made it worse? Did it radiate? That's how you talk to Claude or Gemini now. And I know, Lindsey, you and I pop back and forth on Claude all the time, sharing each other's projects and documents and all that stuff. I don't know if you're running into the same thing, but for us, for the listeners, when we're talking about large language models, we're not talking about Chat GPT-4 from 2022. This is a new world, and the time that you spend, if you have an hour, any Saturday or Sunday, and you just spend an hour on YouTube watching one video, you're probably 5xing your performance at your job. You're probably reducing the amount of time that you're spending on your regular life, whether it's planning a trip to the Tetons or Hilton Head or planning your kid's birthday party. It's all in there, and so a lot of our productions that we do here through AI and healthcare and the stuff that you and I write is just trying to get people curious enough. So maybe as we talk through this stuff, take the crowd. My last tech question before we get into the kind of the future of healthcare, because that's really what we're here to talk about. I just want to get everybody caught up when we had an expert. Talk about multimodal and why that's different, why that's so critical for something complicated like cancer medicine or healthcare, because it's not all words in healthcare. We've got path reports, we've got slides that are digital, pixelated slides. We've got 200 CT scans of Lindsey's dad's lung or my mom's chest. And what we mean when we talk about multimodal input and why that's critical if we're going to do true improvements in medicine.
Yeah, I think it's a fancy word, but it comes from a very simple observation, which is like, for most healthy humans, you have multiple senses, right? And a lot of times you can't put your finger on it, but you have a great doctor, she'll detect something quickly. And it's because you have like so many doctors talk to you say, don't give me an AI to diagnose. Get an AI to give me all the stuff, then I can diagnose quickly. And like, interesting, right? And so what they're looking at is they look at lots of different signals, including the patient, and they're able to deduce what actually is going on much faster than just looking at a text report. And so we're finding the same thing in AI. So that what we did is made a big bet. I mean, Google did on Gemini, where essentially they said, don't just start with text. We started with king minus man plus woman equals, right? That was 2015.
Lindsey, yeah.
And we said, no, we can actually take text, images, and sound, break them up into little blocks we call tokens, and now you can mix them all up. And so now you can take the sound of an ambulance, you can take the sound of of what's happening in the scene, you can take the music, and it's all just coming together. And what's happening is AI can find correlations and relationships between all the different componentry, that just like the cat and dog function, that we can't describe. But if we give us sufficient data and sufficient guidance, it starts to find patterns for us, much like a doctor does. And so what it causes you to do is take a step back, because instead of like chasing text or chasing code, you step back and say, we fundamentally want to understand our observable universe. Literally, what can we observe with our naked eye, with the human? And now we can amplify that later, but let's start there. And then start to train it on here's what a sound of a siren is. Here's the fire engine. So here's a fire engine, guess the sound. Like a bird chirping. No, it's wrong. Right. And then you take the sound, say, what would you visualize this as? Oh, here's the fire engine. right? And then how would you describe it? You would say red truck. No, you say fire engine. So you can train it on how all those things fit. And then you step back and then magic happens, right? Because we're finding now it finds patterns that we're not trained on.
What really excites me about that exact topic, and from my biomarker developing clinical trials mind, is how we fundamentally, like how, just to break it down on how it works, and I'm sure you can appreciate this, is we have the goal of identifying cancer in someone who is asymptomatic, who is a general population, they meet X criteria, but we don't believe that they have cancer, right? So we want to be able to do a test that can find it at early stages. So in order to build that test, you have to put the data in for the model to do the analytical validity, and you have to have samples from patients who you expect you would be using in real world. And we know there's often a disconnect between how we build this and what the samples we put in compared to what we would use in real world. So you go through the process and you've got your analytical validity and you're putting in all of the details of these patients, and then you run that and you might get really good performance. Well, it was also put in you're doing it in silo, in isolation. And so you've got your performance, then you start using it and you work on your clinical validity. So you're matching, right, your samples that come in with your analytical validity. And I think one of the challenges in this space right now is that once you get from your analytical validity and your performance is great, and then you shift and you get to your clinical validity and the performance is okay, or it's good enough to move forward further, and then you still have to get your clinical utility and your real world data. And that's where there seems to be this disconnect with what the data in, data out, and what our performance is versus what happens when we actually use it in real world. And one of the things you brought up earlier was that physicians, there's this thing called physician, you didn't say the word, but physician bias. So if I have a patient, I could have two patients with the same scenario come into me. I might set them down two different pathways. It's not dictated. It's going to be very hard to pull that from an LLM or doing a scrape of the records. But the way that I react or that a different provider reacts could be based on things that we don't dictate. Smell of a patient, the way that they fidget, tremor, little subtle things that you can't document. And there's some programs now that are starting to be able to track that, where you can actually track the physician bias and why someone would use something or why they wouldn't. But I wonder, or I like both of your perspectives on the challenge that we're seeing in the disconnect between analytical and clinical validity that we see in creating these tests, whether it's screening, MRD, or mutational analysis, not mutational analysis, I'll actually put that out, but training these models, and then what we see in real world and how, obviously it's all AI. I mean, we hadn't used that. Doug, you mentioned this earlier, that like people are like, oh, AI is new. Well, we've been using it for years in all the blood-based testing. But how can we actually use it to continue to improve the nuance between the data that's going in and the data that's coming out? Because there's still a disconnect. Like we still haven't quite achieved that precision yet.
It's accelerating, I would say, probably the last 6 to 12 months, because the tools are training themselves. Scott, we were talking in the pre-show about your colleague, James Manuka, and he has a great terminology he's used at a Google Summit forum a few months ago. And he said that AI is not just general purpose technology, meaning not like steam or electricity or the internet, where it's applicable in every vertical to improve something. He said it is an inventor of inventions. And I think that stuck with me, because the difference is that electricity can't make more electricity. The internet is already connected to everything. It can't make new connecting, but AI can, and this may be hyperbole. I can't document this, but I read this, some social media source, that the most recent release of Claude was trained by Claude in 9 days. And Claude is writing its own code now, and they are iterating from within. And obviously they're shipping a ton of product. It was legal 2 days ago. It was financed 3 days ago. I'm sure healthcare is rapidly coming. But when a model can build itself anew in 9 days, you're talking about levels of progression, this recursive idea that is so different than anything our doctors have ever dealt with before, because we're used to problem number one, identify receptor number one, identify target number one, identify putative drug agent that will hit said target. But by the time we've developed the drug, the target's changed. It's almost like we play chess as cancer doctors, but the pieces that we're playing against change the rules, and now the bishop can slide, or the rook doesn't have to follow the L and you know what I mean? For us, the game is changing so fast that I think physicians are reeling. So Lindsay's point is well taken for us. I'd love your take on this as we train these models and they're training themselves. How are we to keep up? Because we demand a different level of precision in medicine than if you're making a video in Hollywood, or if you're nudging me in Netflix to watch another episode of Bridgerton or The Bear. It's completely different when it's detection of cancer in a 38-year-old woman with 4 kids, right?
Right. Yeah. Couple observations, Doug. I mean, Lindsay, this might help a little bit. Well, Mark Andreessen. So he said what's happening with things like Claude Code and Gemini and OpenAI's got their version. And it's sort of like who's on first, someone's always in first, but it's intoxicating because what happens is as an engineer right now, I see it. And my daughter's an engineer also. She builds AI for a small startup. She's never worked harder. I've never worked harder because you're in there. You're like, wait a second, this used to take me weeks. This was 15 minutes. And then it's intoxicating. You're like, what about this? And now then you start to run other models and you're like, you gotta be kidding me. This used to take me weeks, months. And so then what happens is you get this high, right? Because the high, there's a reason people can do science. It's a reward. If you're taking an idea, you make it material, or you're starting to improve your patient. I'm like, what else can I do? Right. And so what happens, these models, we're now hooking them back up so that it starts to do simpler and simpler tasks, or simpler and more complex tasks where it tries something, it evaluates it, and it actually completes a whole task for you. And then that becomes a component, and you build things on top of that, and you build on top of that. And now you build whole subsystems where you can now have an idea, and it's like you've self-trained yourself, all these models who go and do work, weeks of work in minutes, and comes back with an answer that is aligned with your kind of quality of an output. And now what's happening is you run out of money because you're sitting there and you're cranking like, I just ran out of tokens. And so what's happening at Google, and I think it's happening other places, is we have to do an allocation at the top. What do we use for our Googlers? What do we use for the outside? Because Googlers is the cost of goods sold and the outside, but the demand's so high, there's not enough chips in the world. So how do you allocate them, right? And so we're also seeing, the point of Lindsay is that you walk through these stovepipes of different data, right? The model, then you get more patient, and eventually the real world evidence. What we're seeing is ability to break through the silos, put something on top of them. We call it a system of intelligence, and now the agents operate there, right? So what's happening now is they're able to uncork this, and now the agent that does each of these they now share information, and on top of that, you have another agent that iterates. And so what you now have is you have this loop on top of the silos where now it's starting to blend the models, and it's the same representation for all the different modalities, which is really fascinating, right? So I think what we're seeing, Doug, is like this arrival. It started with chat, but now it's the kind of thing where I have so many running, I run out of capacity. And then Lindsay, what we're doing is, as you get more and more modalities together, it finds patterns that we struggle to describe, right? And it often finds that, and what my friends at NASA do is they find it fascinating too, but they treat agents as idiot savants, right? I think what did Sam say this week is like, I found some word for his GG, like a spectrum version of an intelligent person of 5.5, you called it this morning, where now you take the input from an AI, you don't trust it blindly, but you use as though it's an idiot savant who goes, I think she's got this. I think she's got this variant. And you're like, And then you evaluate that using like anyone else would. And that's how NASA deals with it. And I think maybe if we did the same thing, Doug, we're going to see the rate of pace of changes is insane. So fast.
This is, I think, really to pull it back to healthcare for the physicians, nurses, clinicians, pharmacists that are listening. This is a seminal moment to just sit with this for a minute. And I'll use my own personal example because I'm not a coder. I am a tech enthusiast, but I'm a practicing medical oncologist. I spent 23 years doing breast cancer, and I discovered these things probably a couple years ahead of most of my peers. So I'm facile at them, but I live in that, and I try to describe it to my friends that aren't in yet, that it feels like you're the Bradley Cooper character in Limitless. You can just work so much faster. And the productivity lets me do 10 different things at once on 4 different LLMs. But I do what you do, and I just let them go, and I just let them cook, and I come back and remind myself I'm in the middle of 10 different projects, and it is a dopamine surge because you're like, oh my gosh, I just did so much work in 20 minutes while I walked the dog, and I come back and I've got 6 completed projects. And for me, it might be a business plan or how to change a care model redesign in our cancer program, or building a prostate cancer center of excellence where it's doing all of the research to find out who the best standard bearers are. But I'm running all 4 of those at the same time on 4 different models. And again, like you, my limiting factor is not actually my human time awake anymore. It's tokens. And I'm willing to pay for them, and I do. And my credit card is just zapping right now. So not everybody will do that, but I'm 10xing my productivity, getting the rush of doing it. And I have the satisfaction of saying that job was delivered at a better output than I would have had I not had the tool. And that's where the magic happens. And you start to realize, holy cow, what happens when everybody figures this out? We are going to be solving things like cancer. We're going to be figuring out how to apply CRISPR-Cas9 to leukemias with 6 genetic defects instead of 1. And we're already making progress using these tools for thalassemias and sickle cell anemias and Huntington chorea. We're not that far away from curing CML. It's a 916 translocation. That's not super hard for CRISPR in 5 years, 3 years. So that's where I get excited, maybe because I started with this, the 3 of us being survivors of families that were deeply touched by cancer. That's why I'm all in on this. It's not because I like to nerd out with Scott and Lindsey. It's because when medicine understands what tech scalers understand, what Netflix understands, what Amazon understands, even what hedge funds understand, or Kroger or Amazon, and we apply this to pattern recognition in our patients, taking that gigantic corpus of unstructured data and making sense of the madness, we're going to save so many people and reduce so much suffering that it's going to make everything we did before pale in comparison. So enough, Doug. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. But that's why I care about this so much. It's why I write about it on LinkedIn or Substack every day. That's why I wrote my book. It's why Lindsey and I work in a company that's here to try and responsibly get physicians to integrate these things into their daily lives. Because ultimately, the people who win aren't the doctors that feel like Bradley Cooper. That's awesome. But it's the patients downstream from me that I can now do what you said. I can teach them in their words and say, give me a real world analogy for this woman. She loves gardening. I need to teach her about how her cancer exists and grows and spreads using 6th grade English and gardening analogies. And I pull it up and I did it today in clinic on Gemini, and I walk into the clinic, and now I have really, really good real world analogies to teach my patient that resonate with her. And it might be a completely different thing for an engineer. I needed to give much more detail to my engineers than I do to this gardener, but I could emote with her using the words that were meaningful and memorable to her as a teacher.